Victoria. On behalf of myself and the committee, I welcome you to tonight's Zoom event. Tonight we're pleased to have Dr. Mark Dapin presenting Australia's Vietnam, Myth versus History. Dr. Dapin is a well-known historian, author and journalist. He has several degrees, including a PhD in military history. His books are often found on shortlists. The Nashos War was shortlisted for the New South Wales Premier's Award for Non-Fiction and won an Alex Buzo Shortlist Prize and the People's Choice Award at the NIB Awards. His Jewish Anzacs and Australia's Vietnam were both shortlisted for the NIB Military History Prize. He's editor of the Penguin Book of Australian War, Writing and From the Trenches, the best Anzac writing of World War I. Myths of War, his 8-part series, Searching for the Truth in Australian Military History, was broadcast by the Radio National earlier this year. Now, Mark has got about 45-50 minutes of presentation. At the end of that, he'll be taking questions. I'll invite you to send a chat message to me so that I can ask him anytime up to and including question time or during question time. You can do this by clicking the chat icon in the middle bottom of the Zoom panel. You'll need to address the question to everyone. When the time comes, I'll read your question, beginning with your first name. Mark has asked me to leave your videos on during the session to give the session a bit more of a real audience feel. It's a bit of a problem, Zoom, for the presenters. They can't obviously see you like they would an ordinary audience or a normal audience. Bear in mind, though, that people will be able to see you. As usual, your microphone should be switched off. So by now you should be on speaker view. And Mark, I now invite you to begin to speak.
I will begin to speak. Thanks, Ben, for asking me here, even though here isn't actually anywhere. It's just my downstairs room. It occurred to me just then that although I used to do this quite a lot, I don't think I've done a public talk about Vietnam since Jeffrey Gray died. So I feel I should dedicate this talk, for what it's worth, to the memory of Jeff, without whom, none of this would have been possible. And also, of course, since Tim Fisher died. Tim was there the first time I spoke in Military History Victoria, and some of the things he said made it into Australia's Vietnam Myth versus History, which I'll get to later. I thought tonight I would speak about my research, about the way I went about my research, and about how I came to my findings and how I felt about my findings, the things that surprised me and the things that I expected. Unfortunately for you lot, that means I have to start with a little bit of biography, I think, autobiography about myself, which is by far my favorite topic apart from Vietnam. I try to remember how I got interested in Australia's Vietnam in the first place, and it seems so long ago, but I think it came from my dad. My dad, I come from England, as no one will be surprised to hear. My dad did his national service in the British Army in the 1950s during the Korean War, and I always thought that he actually fought in the Korean War, but in fact he was stationed in Sherwood Forest. Scholars of the Korean War may be aware of the fact Sherwood Forest wasn't actually a frontline position, but my dad was there to defend it nonetheless. I would no doubt have defended it had he not been a telephonist in the Ordnance Corps. But I grew up with my dad's sort of bedtime stories about national service. And, he stuck to the funny bits like all dads do, and how he was no good on the rifle range and hated the bugler in the morning and stuff. But they were really, when I look back on it, they were pretty much the only stories my dad told me about his life. He died when I was 21, and I hadn't lived with him since I was 10 years old. So I was probably more familiar with his national service years than virtually any other period. And when he died, my stepmother had really very, very little to give me. But one of the few things I got was his service record, which anyone familiar with British National Service records will know doesn't say anything at all. It just says a sober gentleman or something at the end. So I always wondered what it was like for my dad, really, because he seemed to really enjoy the army. And when he died, I went to see my stepmother, and I said, what did he like about it? What did he like about being told what to do? Which I couldn't imagine at 22 or whatever. And she said, your dad didn't know what to do. And of course he didn't when he was 18. I mean, who does know what to do when they're 18? And I wondered all that time, my dad's going to be a mystery that I'm never going to solve. But I think if I'd have stayed in England, I would have ended up studying the British National Service scheme, about which there's some excellent books written. But when I came to Australia, when I was 26, and I was always interested in the Australian National Service scheme, particularly the fact that so many proportionate to the British National Service scheme, percentage-wise, actually went to war. And it was that, more really than the Vietnam War, that interested me initially. So I've done kind of three separate studies, I suppose, of Vietnam. The first one was a book called The Nashos War. And what I was trying to do there was write military sociology, really. I wanted to understand what it was like for people like my dad, who, although Australian Nashos were obviously 2 years older than British National Servicemen, my dad was in the army from 18 to 20. And actually spent a small amount of time in Germany defending Germany from the Koreans. But what it would have been like for young men similar to my dad, just taken out and plonked in Vietnam. And I knew from my dad's stories. My dad's stories weren't war stories. They were, telephonist stories, boys going to dance stories. At the very best, fist fights with other soldiers' stories. So I knew that joining in the army didn't necessarily mean being in a combat role. I should also say, and I was interested in people that weren't in combat roles. I was interested in the POGO, I was interested in the Ordnance Corps, I was interested in the people in Vung Tau, because it was easiest for me to imagine my dad as one of those blokes. Also, as bad luck would have it, when my dad left my mum, we moved to Aldershot, which, again, as I'm sure many of you will know, it was certainly, when I grew up there, a huge garrison town. The army was by far the dominant industry, and it was at not the height, but certainly a high point in the Troubles in Northern Ireland. So where I lived, we had the depot para, we had 2 para, we had 3 para on rotation to Northern Ireland, fighting the Republicans rather, 4 months of the year, then coming back and fighting the civilians for the other 8 months till they could go back to Ireland and fight the Republicans again. And we also had the catering corps based there. Transport, was based there, and sections, fragments of virtually every other unit in the British Army. So I grew up. I only realised recently, I think my interest in Vung Tau and base there was probably partly because I imagined that as a sort of Aldershot by the sea. I began, as I say, researching the Nashos War with this idea of sort of writing an autobiography of the National Service Scheme with a compendium of the various men's experiences. I interviewed for that book about 120 veterans, about 120 people, about 105 of whom I think, it's hard to remember now, were National Service veterans who'd gone to Vietnam. I became aware about halfway through the project that some of my initial assumptions were incorrect. I had first met Vietnam veterans. In fact, I knew some Vietnam veterans, but I didn't know they were. They were just kind of friends of mine. But I'd met Vietnam veterans as a group at the Vietnam Veterans Motorcycle Club, in their clubhouse in Queensland. And it surprised me at the time, I suppose, and I commented on it when I wrote about it, that they pretty much all told the same story. They all told fragments of one larger story, I suppose, where they, and you know, the VVMC is obviously composed of regs and Nashos. You know, they went to fight a war, they didn't understand, and when they came back, they were spat on, they had blood poured over them, they were demonstrated against, and they became mentally ill as a consequence of one thing or the other thing, or both. And I imagined that experience, because it was articulated almost as creative memory, and it was articulated so clearly, that must represent the broader experience of veterans. And I really did think that they're all at least potentially going to be actively mentally ill. It became clear to me that they were not, happily, although some of them may well have had their spells. They were articulate, thoughtful, often well-adjusted, often very successful in their chosen fields, because, you know, they were often so driven, I suppose, and because they knew the value of discipline. People who had absolutely unendingly broad range of responses to what were essentially a very broad range of experiences. Although we wouldn't have known that. I only really realised that talking to individuals. When they're a group, they kind of fall back on the same story. One of the things that I was trying to find out initially, there's a famous story that in January, it's repeated several times, and, you know, most prominently in Paul Ham's book, Vietnam, the Australian War. In January 1970, an artilleryman returns from Vietnam to Sydney Airport, into airport crowded with, I think they say, 500 militant students, 150 guys, 150 return men come off the plane, and there's this massive pitched battle with these banner waving students, calling them baby killers, or I'm not sure he says they call them baby killers, but most of the stories do. And in the end, the 150 return men smashed the 500 students, as of course they would in real life, and the cops looked the other way. And I thought, oh, that's a really strong incident to base a kind of home front anecdote around. So I tried to find out when it might have happened. I looked through the newspapers, Sydney Morning Herald, for January, and there's nothing about it. I looked for February. I tried to use the nominal roll to isolate artillery guys that had come home to see if there was any particular day that they'd come home on. I finally got the schedule for the Qantas homecoming craft, and they said, I believe, I can't quite remember now, I think it was Tuesdays they came back. Went back to look at the paper on Tuesdays. It must be, this demonstration must be mentioned on Tuesday. But it wasn't mentioned on any Tuesday in any Sydney paper. And I thought, oh, well, there'll be a memory of it on the left. You know, it's a huge demonstration. About 500 people in a pitched battle with 150 servicemen. You know, it's the biggest political violence in Australia since 1968, when the US Embassy was attacked in Melbourne. And one of the biggest, you know, in post-war history. There's nothing in any memoirs of the left, there's nothing in any history of any militant group. And I spoke to the Skippy Squadron, the guys who call themselves the Skippy Squadron, the aircrew, the Veterans Aircrew Organisation. And I said, do you remember any of this? And they associate themselves very closely with veterans. They see themselves as having been an integral part, I suppose, in the war effort. And he said, no, I don't know where these stories come from. He said, the guy who ran the Skippy Squadron said, I tried to find this out. I went to the policing records. I saw the police stations. Like, does anybody know of any such an incident? And he said, I find no evidence anywhere. And he wanted the evidence. You know, he really wanted this to have happened. And it was he who told me that, you know, this idea that veterans came home in the dead of night to avoid the attentions of protesters. And we've established, or he had established, that there were no protesters anyway. And he said that's not why they came home in the dead of night. And he explained the technical reasons why the guys who came back with Qantas had to return at 11 o'clock because the business class had to be taken out and put back in again in time for their flight. The planes were then used to fly to New Zealand next morning. And in a way, I was kind of disappointed because I wanted that dramatic centerpiece. But in a way, I was fascinated that there could be such a quotidian explanation, you know, that there could be such a technical explanation for them flying back, that it could all be about seating plans, that it could all be about flight schedules. And I continued to interview veterans, and it's hard to put a percentage on it because I didn't tabulate it, but I think maybe 3, 4, 5, maybe 3 veterans after I'd discovered that not only was there no reports of this airport demonstration involving the artilleryman, but there was no reports of any airport demonstration ever. And it was, for various reasons, it was incredibly unlikely to have happened logistically. People kept telling me these stories, and they were often they were ambiguous. They'd say we were demonstrated against when we came back, or when we came back to the airport. And sometimes, like all these stories, it was a sort of collective we. They didn't actually mean himself or his unit or his plane load. They just meant we were. And one guy, he said, no, I came back and there was a demonstration. And he was like, you know, he's a good man. I cannot stress that these are good, honourable, honest people. This guy was actually a military policeman, if I remember correctly. And he said there was a demonstration, you know, met us from the airport. Met us at the airport. And I said, are you sure? What do you mean by a demonstration? How many people? And he said, oh, just a small group. And I said, well, how many? And he said, I think it was 3. And I said, oh, a demonstration of 3. And he said, they might have just been waiting to pick up their luggage. And I wondered if people had ever really interrogated these stories, if people had ever really said, how many people, who were they? When you say a demonstration, was it in fact somebody looking for their suitcase? And a guy, a former infantryman in Broken Hill, told me a story where they weren't let out of the plane. He said, we were told there's a group of people gathered outside the airport and we don't know whether they're going to welcome you or demonstrate against you, but stay on the plane till we find out. And I said to him, when did you come back? And it was November 1969. And I said, there were no demonstrations. I looked, you know, and this, I'm kind of torn because you do not carry out oral history interviews with people and then start contradicting them. It's poor practice, you don't get their story. But in the end, I guess I was trying to convince him of his history, about which I really knew nothing. So after that, I had a bit of a crisis, and I thought, why am I doing this? Why have these stories happened? Why are these guys telling me things that didn't happen? Because these guys are telling me things that didn't happen here. Maybe none of the stuff they tell me is true. And it really started keeping me up at night. And I thought, what am I writing this book for? It could just be a load of rubbish. And I ended up speaking to, I forget his name now. It's the guy who made the first documentary about Long Tan. Really, really good movie. And he said, I said, what's the point of me interviewing people? I sort of wondered why I bothered being a journalist as well. I said, what's the point of me interviewing people if they can't tell the truth? And he said, no, it's just some people sometimes don't know or don't tell the truth about some things. And I realized, of course, that's right, of course. And I slowly got back into the work. But once I suppose I realized that the protesters, the airport protesters were a myth, I started wondering about the rest of that story. And somebody pointed me towards a book called The Spitting Image, published in America. It was Dennis O'Donnell, actually, Nashos, who kind of rebelled and ended up in Holsworth. He never went to Vietnam, catering corps guy. He said, you should read Spitting Image. And The Spitting Image said that these stories of airport demonstrations originated in the Jane Fonda movie, Coming Home. And until 1979, nobody spoke of these demonstrations. The first, which was, of course, 4 years after the fall of Saigon, the first airport demonstration on record is against is it Bruce Dern in that movie. And he went on to say that the stories that veterans were spat on, which I was told I certainly told several times, but I'd also read many times, particularly in Paul Ham's book. He said no veteran in America had ever said he was spat on until John Rambo in First Blood said the protesters spat on me. And so I started to look back and trying to find when this first spit was in Australia. And it was not the first story of a veteran being spat on. And it was a sort of spray of spit at Sydney Airport delivered by a woman. It's always a woman, as part of one of these demonstrations that can't possibly have happened anyway. And it came out, that story was published in the same year as First Blood was released in Australia. And if you trace the spitting story, it starts off very small. It starts off in 82. It grows and grows and grows and grows. And now, like, there's a media interview with a Vietnam veteran who doesn't say he was spat on. It's quite a rare thing. And I presume that that's because the journalists asked everyone, what was it like for you when you came home? Were you spat on? And nobody wants to disappoint the journalists. And they go, oh, yeah, we were spat on, or I was spat on, or whatever. And I noticed in Peter Yule's new book, The Long Shadow, he manages to find someone who, despite the fact he's an infantry guy, and despite the fact he says he would never go near university pubs because you're bound to be spat on by women, he was spat on more times than he could even count. And that is peak spit. Like, we have reached a point where people cannot say they were spat on any more than that guy was. And again, I'm not saying nobody was ever spat on, but I'm saying there was clearly not an epidemic of demonstration-based spitting, because A, demonstrations didn't exist, and B, the stories are, by which I mean, of course, there were many demonstrations against the Vietnam War, but the demonstrations in airports didn't exist. And B, I'm thinking about growing up in Aldershot and what the army were like in civvies, and the idea of, student protesters attacking trained soldiers. That's not the way real life happens in a garrison town. It's them jumping you, not I was a student at the time. So I look back all these, trying to work out what was real and fake. I was surprised. One of the first books I ever read about Vietnam when I came out here, I think, was Ashes of Vietnam, Stuart Rentall's early oral history. And in that, he includes accounts of war crimes by Australian troops and witnessed by Australian Viet Cong war crimes witnessed by Australian troops. I would say, with the possible exception of one account, they're all, I hesitate to say fictional, but they're fictional. You know, and I went back again. I'm thinking, so there's rape nuns. There's one particular famous story in Rentoul where Australian troops rape and murder a group of Vietnamese women, and some Maori guy has sex with a corpse, and it's quite clearly an adaptation of a story about American troops, which also is probably untrue, that appears unsourced in Mark Baker's Nam. So much of the Australian experience on the side, you know, the side of both the, you know, feeling besieged by militant protesters and, you know, committing war crimes in Vietnam. It's actually just kind of indeed adapting the experiences of the fictional John Rambo. It's adaptations of the Australian experience, of the American experience, and it becomes an entirely kind of folkloric picture of life in both Vietnam and Australia in the late 60s, early 70s. So in Vietnam, so I wrote this book, and I wanted to, I guess, be true to all the people who had given me their time and cake and biscuits. As you can imagine, in the 100 veterans' homes or whatever, I had a lot of cake and biscuits and cups of tea. So I didn't particularly want to talk about the contradictions in their testimonies. I used the testimony that seemed to me to be correct, and Jeff Gray said, anyone tells you anything, get their service record, which at the time you could do. Find their service record, and even if it's housed with their service record, find either another piece of documentary evidence or another person who witnessed it. And for the most part, I did that, and you know, Jeff's words remain with me today in more or less anything I do, although people's service records, as men's service records, are certainly no longer available to anybody who petitions the National Archives as they were back then. I suspect that's partly my fault, because I interviewed Normie Rowe, and in the interview, I actually pulled his service record before I spoke to him. And he was on a charge in Vietnam, fairly trivial charge. And I brought that up, and I said, what was all that about? And he said, how could you possibly know about that? And I said, I've seen his service record. And he was kind of mildly outraged, and 2 months later, he couldn't get the service records. But might have had nothing to do with me. Anyway, I came to, so that came out. I put in the Nashos War, which is a very big book to write anyway. Very, very easy book to read, you'd love it. I put in a couple of doubts I had, but they were very peripheral, very. Then Jeff was supervising my PhD, which was initially, again, just a military sociological study. I had this massive row with the ethics committee at UNSW because they said I couldn't use the names of people I interviewed. I said, but there's a reason that there's so much that is untrue circulated about these issues, is that people do not go by their real names. You know, the untrue Australian atrocity stories in Rintoul's Ashes of Vietnam are by pseudonymous or anonymous sources. Pseudonymous and anonymous sources plague the literature, and particularly it was Jeff who said, you find somebody who's actually alive who says they witnessed these war crimes, who's actually real. I said, no, we've got to name real people. The ethics committee said no, it'll drive them mad or whatever they thought it was. I said, we went back and forth for a while. They said, it's your job to satisfy us. And I said, no, it's your job to facilitate this for me. Unfortunately, I was wrong and they were right. And in the end, I pulled off, said, I'm not going to do anything with you people. I'll work from the record, so I wouldn't need ethics approval. So I didn't use any of my oral history interviews for the PhD thesis. I just worked on the public record. And the PhD thesis was a mixture of looking at this, I guess, home front mythology and war crimes mythologies, and also looking more closely at Mike O'Brien's study of Seven Ra. So Mike, as you know, I'm sure you'll all know, was an intelligence officer with 7th Battalion, and in the late 90s, he did a very comprehensive survey of the battalion association. I think he had about 250 responses across 7th Battalion's 2 tours. But he'd never kind of tabulated it. He'd used slabs of the responses in his book, Conscripts and Regulars, but he'd never brought things down to percentages. So he allowed me to do that, which gave me, I guess, some idea of I was looking at the time of differences between national servicemen and regulars in Vietnam, and at least I can speak with some slight authority, thanks to Mike, about the differences within Seven Ra across the 2 tours. The main difference, I got to say, I found, having broken down all Mike's data, was that regular soldiers, the highlight of Vietnam for them was operations, i.e. action. National servicemen, the clear highlight was R&R, i.e. drinking. What it says about Australians, I don't know. But there was a bit of a surprise to me. Beyond that, the contrast with what one would expect. The national servicemen were better educated, broadly a more middle class cohort, and as the ballot continued, they became better educated and more middle class as people's academic and trade deferrals expired. But I expected that. I thought when Australia's Vietnam Myth versus History came out that I'd get a lot of flack for some of the things I said. I didn't mean to say that the feeling against veterans didn't exist. I just meant to say that these events, the stories that were told around them, hadn't happened. And I didn't mean to say that there had been no war crimes in Vietnam, but these Australian war crimes, specifically the way they were told, didn't happen. And what I came to think was that the spitting stories, the blood throwing stories, although the blood story obviously has its genesis in Nadine Jensen running at 1st Battalion, admix of kerosene, whatever it was, in '66 at Welcome Home Parade in Sydney. But most of these stories weren't actually recounting anything that happened historically, events that happened historically. They're recounting a feeling that people felt rejected, and that feeling was real. The feeling that they felt personally protested against, and that feeling was real too. A feeling that among certain sections of society that war crimes were committed in Vietnam, that Australians must have committed these war crimes because that's what Americans did all the time. whoever, I doubt whether a veteran, a real veteran, was the source of those stories in Rintoul, but whoever was, genuinely felt that if it wasn't factually true, then the feeling was true. It was a way of expressing an idea of what might have happened. And I suspected I would be misunderstood, and I thought I would be pilloried. In fact, I wasn't really. I think I was largely ignored, which I'm far more accustomed to anyway. But I went to the ABC and I said, I'm going to be, I want to lay low for a while. Can you give me a job script editing? I figured script editing in the ABC you can hide. And I walked out of it a presenter, which was the last thing I ever thought of doing, and certainly the last thing I wanted to do when I came in. And I did a documentary series called Myths of War, which again came from the idea of the Vietnam myths. And I wondered how much else is true, that we take for granted about Australian military history, and how much is folkloric. I thought I'd get hit for that a lot harder than I was as well, but all I got was one guy who complained to the ABC that I was a militarist. His thinking being that because I argued that not everybody was against the Vietnam War, which is, to be fair, is a position very rarely heard on the ABC. That not everybody was against the Vietnam War, and that there was a pro-Vietnam War movement. He believed that simply because I said it existed, I must be a part of it, or it's spiritual air. And I guess at the end of all this, the thing that does puzzle me the most, and I theorized all this about people making stories to express their feelings, but what I don't understand is how the pro-Vietnam War movement, which was at a time, it's certainly in the early 60s, and so through Santa Maria and the NCC, was larger and more militant and as active as the anti-war movement, how it's just disappeared from history. Why? I mean, I can see some possibilities. I can see why some people might disavow their former positions. But I mean, some people don't, and it's clear that some people like Gerard Henderson don't. And yet nobody speaks out and said, no, we existed, we did this. It wasn't all everybody against the veterans. We supported them when they were there. We supported them when they came back, and we supported the war with these arguments. They're not incoherent arguments. They're, and at the time they dominated public debate. So that I never solved to my own satisfaction. I'm not quite sure how long I've been talking. I've been talking for 40 minutes, and I think it was a single sentence. So I'm happy to talk some more, or I'm happy to take questions.
We'll take you another 5 minutes, Mark.
You want me to go another 5 minutes?
Something like that, until you run out of breath next time.
It'll take us till 8:20. One thing I found with the interviews, people said that it would be the Vietnam veterans won't talk to you, they won't talk honestly to you. I'm not sure whether I thought they would or not initially. People said they won't be open to you. They said they only talk to each other. They don't talk to outsiders. I found from very early on a couple of stumbling interviews, but after that, I found that people were incredibly generous with their time and their tea and cakes and their insights and their memories. That in fact, at the age they were then, and I suppose I must have begun 8 or 9 years ago, these men wanted to talk. I mean, in part, some of them had nothing much else to do but talk. Some of them had obviously spoken about it at length, and they'd sort of refined their stories. Others had never spoken about it before, particularly some of the pogos, because no one was interested until I came along with my puzzling questions. So I was quite comfortable talking to them. After a while, you get to absorb their vocabulary. You get to use words they use. You understand their jokes. But what I found very, very hard to deal with was people crying while I interviewed them. And this happened, now it's hard for me to recall how many times, but certainly dozens and dozens of times. A guy would be speaking to me and they'd gradually start tilting their head back, just back, as if they're about to headbutt me or something. But they were trying to stop a tear from falling under their glasses. And then slowly, it doesn't matter how far you tap your head back, eventually the tip your head back, eventually the tear does roll down. And in the end, I started to say to people at the beginning, you might find yourself crying. If you do, please don't be embarrassed. I'm really used to this. But I wasn't. I never really got used to it. And people were crying at moments that you would never imagine. Like, they weren't, occasionally, somebody would cry about a lost friend, a mate who'd been killed. But I think they often cried about when they remembered really kind of day-to-day details. And it kind of moves me now when I think about it. They were crying for their youth. They were crying for their 20s. They missed them. Yeah. And one time I cried as well. There's this little fella. He was 7th Battalion as well. And he should never have been in the army. Like when he joined, I don't know how he got through the medicals, but when he joined up, he still played with trains. He still played with Meccano. And, he was bullied at basic training. He ended up infantry because there's sort of nothing else for him. But he got to Vietnam and he said, they made him the hygiene guy. He's obviously not going to be a killer. And he said, I cleaned all the toilet seats for him. And they called me blowfly. And he was really hurt when he realized that other people will call their hygiene people blowfly, hygiene men blowfly as well, because for him it had made him feel distinct and recognized and loved, too much to say, but wanted and important. And he said he'd just been to a battalion reunion with Barry Heard, actually, the guy who wrote Well Done These Men. He said Barry and that had come up to him and said, mate, you didn't go out with us, but we always remember coming back from the field and seeing you with your big smile waiting for us. And he started crying and I started crying. But then he died of cancer. Anyway, there's an uplifting story for you to leave you with.
Okay. Right, well, thank you very much for that.
A pleasure.
Now, if you could go on to chat to ask questions. We do have a couple already. Jason has asked, what was it about the presentation of Tim Fisher that piqued your attention?
Oh, yeah. So when I was at the conference here on conscription, Tim Fisher gave a talk. He said what he's often said in the media, that he suspected that the ballot was rigged, which is something that Normie Rowe has also said time and again. I suspected that the ballot wasn't rigged. I think the idea, again, that the ballot was rigged is an expression of a feeling men have that, only 1 in 7 of their age group was selected for national service and only 1 in 4 of them went to Vietnam, so whatever the figures are. So how can it be? How can it have been them? How can it have been them? You know, it in a way is from their point of view, it's rigged. It's rigged against them. But that's not the argument that is often made. The argument made is that, you know, certain groups of men, you could tell by the call-up when the army was short of engineers, there'd always be a bunch of engineers in the next call-up. But obviously that was accounted for by the fact that people's deferrals ended as the war progressed. And of course, you had eventually in one kind of hit, you'd get a bunch of time-served engineers, then you get a smaller bunch of graduate engineers. It's not because the army had any particular use for engineers. And often, you know, I found engineers who were working in non-engineering roles in the army because the army didn't, always national servicemen, because the army actually didn't need that many national service engineers. But what Tim's kind of thundering on about how we should find out why this is, and, you know, somebody tinkered with the edges of it. And I just didn't believe it. And then I went back through my cuttings, and I found out in 1966, somebody at the Department of Labour and National Services spoke to the press. I was just looking at this earlier, and I have to put my glasses on. I hope it doesn't reflect. Don't make me look evil. So a department spokesman said, eventually all youths selected by ballot were medically examined. Those left over from one intake and those whose deferment expired joined a pool from which draftees considered for the next intake were drawn. Generally speaking, there was no handpicking of draftees. If only a specific number of youths from each ballot came up for medical examination, how were they chosen? And he said they were chosen, the spokesman said, in 66, those who express a desire to go in first, and then in order of age. Now that had either been, it's no great national scandal, it makes perfect sense, but it hadn't been said before, and it had actually been denied that you could ever you could ever be chosen for national service because you wanted to be. You know, it's against the whole vibe of national service, that's supposed to be conscription. But they're saying, yes, they specifically took first the people who wanted to go first. And I would never have gone back and looked if I hadn't, if Tim hadn't hit the idea so hard that day. And I mean, I could talk about this a little more, this idea of going back and researching. But I've realized that, and again, maybe everyone knew it apart from me, but I've realized that the way to go about testing a proposition isn't to try and prove it wrong, but to try and prove it right, to do everything you can to find evidence that supports the position, rather than everything you can to find evidence to tear it down. And so when I'm talking about the airport demonstrations, I wasn't looking for people to deny it. I was looking for people who witnessed it. And only when I realized that there was no witnesses and no documentary evidence did I feel like I could make a case that I think Jeff described it as not quite, I don't think he said watertight, I think he said a better word than that. Anyway, it was certainly the biggest compliment he paid me, possibly because it was the only one. Another question?
Yes, Marcus Fielding says, thanks for your presentation, Mark.
Pleasure.
Do you think the folkloric phenomena you described might also be present in the US?
Yeah, I think all these ideas are present in the US, and many of them began there. But what surprised me again was how prevalent they are in New Zealand, where there was certainly no documented widespread rejection of men who were, they're all regulars, and a lot of them came from country communities and returned to country communities. But in New Zealand, there was a big demonstration in '71, again in I think it was an SAS homecoming parade, where protesters really did throw red paint around, as they are so often folklorically depicted as doing. and this seems to have caused, this has become part of the collective memory of all New Zealand veterans. Again, in New Zealand, these stories exist about soldiers coming home to the dead of night to face demonstrations. And it's absolutely impossible in New Zealand. They came home to military air bases. There's no possibility that protesters could get in. But the stories exist the same.
Okay. Ken says it's more a comment than a question.
Oh, there's always one.
Yeah, well,
Sorry,
you can do what you will with it. Tim was bloody well right about the word random and its meaning. So, and Graham asked, did you ever determine if national servicemen had the option to serve in Vietnam or not?
Yeah, I did. Yeah, and I wrote and spoke about this, but I know it makes no difference. But so in the end, I was speaking to a guy who was a radiographer, and he said to me, because half the blokes, certainly in infantry, say that a parade occurred, we were told to step forward or not step forward or whatever, and everybody stepped forward, or only 3 people didn't. And in other units, people were invited to see their commanding officer. Military police said that they were given the option of going or not going by their commanding officer. But, it's about half and half, people said. But when people said they were given the choice or not, but when men said they were given the choice, they tended to, or not given the choice, they tended to say, we were all given the choice, or none of us had a choice. And obviously, neither of these propositions were correct. So as I say, I was interviewing this radiographer, and he said, I didn't want to go to Vietnam. I was against the war. I wrote a letter to the minister saying I'm willing to serve in Australia, continue to serve in Australia as a radiographer, but if you go to Vietnam, I will desert. I have a wife and kids. I've got compassionate reasons for staying here. And I got a letter back saying the Army's needs supersede your own. We need you. You're going, son, sort of thing. And he actually had copies of both letters, which is amazing, really. And I reproduced the letter in Vietnam, the Australian War. That's Paul Ham's book, in Australia's Vietnam Myth versus History. And it didn't make any difference. People still said, the people that thought that everybody had volunteered still told me that everyone had volunteered. I could show them a bit of paper, it didn't make any difference, even though this guy clearly hadn't volunteered. When the book came out, a guy from the Ordnance Corps sent me his service record. Clearly he hadn't volunteered. He was put on charges for refusing to obey orders, refusing to board a transport, but he still ended up there. Which is not to say that I think it was a widespread phenomenon that people who didn't want to go were forced to go at all. Like, why would you? I suspect there were more of them in the Ordnance Corps. Was it the Ordnance Corps? I think it was. Ordnance and service, where it didn't really make a lot of difference to the survival of anyone, whether you went or not, when it did happen. But certainly there were people who were not given the choice and more or less forced to go. And certainly if you, as far as I know, and I'm trusting someone else who's done the research on this, there is no record in regiment, in battalion diaries, whatever. Not that battalion diaries are perfect for the years before Vietnam, the time before Vietnam, but there's no record of these parades. Now, if they were held in secret and nobody bothered recording them. People think they signed a form saying that they would or wouldn't go. There's no such form in anyone's service records that I've seen, although there is a form, a CMF did have a kind of similar, a form with a similar feel. Yeah.
Okay, thank you. Did you interview any of those who volunteered for national service at the age of 18? If so, did their attitude different from those called up at the age of 20?
I think you had to be 19 to volunteer, actually. Yeah, I think, did I interview anybody who volunteered at 19? I may have, but I don't recall. I'd certainly interviewed people who had volunteered for national service when their numbers hadn't come up, but I didn't notice anything distinct about them. They had similar experiences and attitudes. I mean, that's the thing, really. I think a lot of blokes would have volunteered. I think if recruitment had been framed differently and paying conditions, to an extent, if paying conditions in the army had been better, then a lot more blokes would have volunteered for the Vietnam War, and there wouldn't have been any, not for the Vietnam War, sorry, for the re-expansion of the Australian Army after Menzies had run it down, and the whole history of Australia's Vietnam would be very different.
Okay. From Marcus again, do you think some folkloric phenomena are beginning to develop around Afghanistan and Iraqi veterans?
Well, that's the interesting thing, isn't it? Yeah, I think about that a lot. I mean, I've talked to quite a number of veterans of Afghanistan, far fewer of Iraq, and they all have this same story about they're driving along. I think you could all probably guess the story. They're driving along and there's civilians by the roadside. They see this guy on his phone and they just get this bad feeling about him, and he puts the phone down and then something happens, so there's an explosion somewhere, and they'd known all along. And I've got a slight suspicion that this Afghan on the mobile is somehow related to the spitting student protester. He's sort of he's an expression of a mistrust of the local people, and he probably was just somebody on the phone to his wife. Maybe, I don't know. And also there are similarities that perhaps you wouldn't expect with Vietnam experience as well. Like I was reading the Daniel Keary VC, the Afghan vet, and he talks a lot about, he's a reg. He comes back out of the army, he comes back from Afghanistan, and he talks in exactly the same terms about how when he loses the army, even when he comes back home from Afghanistan, he loses contact with his friends from the regiment. He ends up in this kind of confusing enemy where nobody understands what he's been through, and his comrades are scattered throughout Australia and the Middle East. He feels alone and isolated, just as stereotypically so many Vietnam veterans have said. So I can't think of a way to end that. So that's that.
Okay. Adrian asked, were you able to detect differences in the responses between those in different corps?
I think the only thing I could truly say, and I'm using a very small sample, bearing in mind of each corps, and this is outside Mike O'Brien's work. There was a lot of post-facto, a surprising amount of post-facto sympathy for the Viet Cong in the SAS. I have no theory as to why that might be, but I think maybe 5 of the SAS guys, SAS Nashos, who are not a big cohort anyway, said they would have fought for Ho Chi Minh if they'd have been Vietnamese. But again, interestingly, I remember speaking to the British SAS guy who wrote a book under the name of Gaz Hunter, and he said he would have fought for the IRA if he was an Irish Catholic. I don't think it's that they would, they just want to fight people. But I think, I don't know, maybe to be effective, they have to have a deeper understanding of the cause of their enemies, maybe.
Okay, has anyone got any more questions? Oh, yes, there is. Marcus. I think the greatest legacy from the Vietnam veteran generation is that the public realised that blaming soldiers for the government's policies was wrong. So as a post-Vietnam veteran, thank you for that. Let's hope it holds.
No worries.
If there's no more questions, I'll close. Perfect timing. Dead on 8 o'clock. God.
All right, time for a beer then.
Yeah. Well, I'll just few more words from me, and then I will let you get away. So, Mark, thank you very much. It was very interesting, and it was excellent actually, and the number of questions is testimony to that. God, some of the big words didn't come out.
Tell me about it.
Yeah. Oh, you didn't sound like you had any trouble.
That's because I only use little words.
All right. Thank you.
But it was for your benefit.
Yes. Yeah. In the next couple of days, on to other business now. In the next couple of days, we'll be sending out an email with a link to Mark's website, and you'll see a number of the books he's got there. In fact, I'm thinking in the future, sometime in the future, to get Mark back to talk about at least one of those. There'll also be a link to another 3-minute feedback survey, and thank you all who filled out the last survey. We do it again. We do take notice. There's a few different questions this time, just to keep us able to retune our offering. Now to other MHHV business. We're working on the next year's program, and it's anticipated that our first speaker event will be on February the 7th at 7 p.m. I'm not quite sure exactly the topic yet, but we will keep you informed well in advance. We also have a one-day conference planned for Saturday, March 20 next year at the Royal Historical Society rooms in the city. The topic will be the Bloody Beachheads, the battles of Gona, Buna, and Sanananda. I think I might have got that last one right this time. And this brings the evening session to a close. The committee and I will wish you all good night. Thanks again to Mark. Thanks to Jason, who keeps us going. And thanks to Jason, who keeps us going behind the scenes. And thank you all for joining us.
Jason.
And we hope you come again. Good night, and have a great and happy festive season.
Indeed. Thanks for coming.